Okay. Good evening. We are so excited to welcome NewsHour producer, Rogin, and breast cancer, I call you a survivor, Allie, for all the wonderful things you've done. We're going to be talking about her book, Beat Breast Cancer Like a Boss, 30 Powerful Stories. And I am one of the fortunate 30 to be included in this wonderful, what I call virtual support group. Right now, because of COVID and years ago, when I was diagnosed in 2005, I had an in-person support group at my treatment center, but that's not happening now. And as I've read through this book, I'm just saying that we have all this support here from 30 different women who have different stories to tell of how they beat breast cancer like a boss. And Allie and I talked about this title, and Allie, share what you mean by beating breast cancer like a boss.
Sure, Molly, and thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your story in the book. When I talk in this book about beating breast cancer, I'm not talking about going into remission and remaining cancer-free. That is far too limiting a concept of what it means to beat this disease, and it certainly leaves out those who die of it, those who are metastatic, and those who are still living with it and who have maybe had multiple occurrences. So what I call for in the book is a redefinition of what it means to beat breast cancer. And I think a lot of us in this community already know this to be true, but what I believe it means is taking it on a daily basis and winning that daily battle, because it really is something that I think most of us take day by day. And there are some days where you feel like you don't even want to get out of bed in the morning. And if you do, that should be celebrated as winning the daily battle, doing the things that you love to do, spending time with people you love, even if it's something as simple as watching your favorite TV show or going for a walk around the block. Those are things you can do to be the master of this disease. So when I talk about beating breast cancer, it's about beating breast cancer every single day.
I know that many of us, we wake up in the morning now with our political climate and COVID, we're beating some kind of sense of disease. So in the early days of your journey, you received comfort and insight and wisdom from a fellow reporter, an awesome woman named Cokie Roberts, who passed away from metastatic breast cancer a couple of years ago. And share with us what it meant to you to be mentored by somebody who was so highly esteemed in a career that you are now moving up in at that time.
Yeah. I should mention that Cokie and I connected when I worked at ABC News, which was a little bit after I went through my experience. However, what is true is I did find solace in the accounting of another young woman whose name is Jessica Queller. We don't actually know each other in person, although we did connect over Twitter as a result of this book. But Jessica wrote a book called Pretty is What Changes. And I should take a step back here and note that I myself am a carrier of the BRCA1 genetic mutation, which increases my risk of breast and ovarian cancer. So I had a prophylactic bilateral mastectomy when I was age 20. And Jessica actually had gone to my same plastic surgeon. And so she wrote a book about her experience. And at the time, there were very few resources dealing with prophylactic surgery, especially for a woman as young as me. And Jessica had written basically the only book out there that provided a resource for me. And so through her story, she really gave me a sense of me not being alone in this. And so even though Angelina Jolie a few years later came out and talked about her experience with the BRCA mutation, and that was something that really put a light bulb in my head that I should write a book like this that includes the stories of powerful, successful, some famous women. It was really Jessica Queller's story that I was able to read when I was going through my BRCA journey, just embarking on it, that really did get me through. So I do think it's important that it's essential that we have people around us who want to help us and want to be that base of support, but it's also essential to hear from people who have gone through the same exact things that we are going through.
Let's go back to that BRCA mutation that you found out about just after leaving the teen years. What led you to think that you might carry the gene? And why did you pursue genetic counseling at such a young age?
Yeah, I knew that I was a good candidate for genetic testing for this particular mutation because of two things. Number one, I had a family history of the more clear strain was ovarian cancer. It actually wasn't breast cancer, but we had a family history of cancer on my father's side, and we're also Ashkenazi Jew on that side of the family. And those two criteria are the two strongest ones that point to testing for the BRCA mutation in particular. There are plenty of other mutations, even just don't know anything about yet, that carry with them different criteria, but this is the particular ones for BRCA. So my dad had tested positive for the mutation years and years before my parents told me that I might want to get tested. He was prompted to get tested because my aunt had ovarian cancer and died. And her 4 daughters ended up getting genetic testing. They all have the gene. One of them had breast cancer. They're all doing fine now. They're all in great health. But my dad found out he was BRCA positive years before because my parents decided that I was too young and that I should wait until I was a little older so that I could make an informed decision about what I wanted to do with that information. So they sat on it, which I think must have been excruciating for them as parents. But they told me when I was, I think they told me when I was a junior in college, and I took a little time just to process. Actually, no, sorry, I got tested immediately. I said, I want to know. Knowledge is power. Let me find out. So I went to a genetic counselor. I went to you, and so I was very lucky that I had the cutting edge of medical knowledge and technology right at my fingertips. So I sat with a genetic counselor at NYU Medical Center. We went over my family history. She said, yes, go get tested. Went down the hall, got my blood test. A few weeks later, I came back and we went over the results. And she said, you're positive. And I had not at that time given any thought to what I would do if the test came back positive. So what I didn't appreciate was the fact that that genetic counselor, who was really my first line of defense when it came to me figuring out what I wanted to do, she didn't suggest prophylactic surgery as an option. She said you should start monitoring for breast cancer earlier, get 6 months, rotate every 6 months, do mammograms and MRIs. That's all a perfectly good option, but I felt that I had been done a disservice because I didn't have all the options laid out clearly to me right at the time when I think that would have benefited me the most. I ultimately ended up deciding, following consulting with other doctors, to have a prophylactic bilateral mastectomy and reconstructive surgery. I put off making that decision until I went and studied abroad, and then I came back and I decided, okay, time to remove these breasts and I just don't want to wait any longer because I don't want to be waking up every day wondering if today is going to be the day that I have breast cancer. And I didn't want to have ticking time bombs on my chest. So yes, I was young. I got a lot of questions about why are you doing this so young, but I wanted to remove the doubt and the fear. And I plan on doing the same thing in relatively short order to reduce my risk of ovarian cancer.
I was going to ask you that. So I think one of the really important nuggets of information that you've conveyed is that your BRCA genetic line came through your father line, the paternal line. Now that you carry the gene, it's going to come through the maternal and the paternal line. And it's really important for individuals to understand that breast cancer is just not a female disease, and that other types of cancers that may be in the family history can contribute to being BRCA positive. So very early, you decide to get this prophylactic double mastectomy, and you mentioned that you had good insurance, but the costs, in addition to what the insurance covered, were significant. And we at the Pink Fund, we're all about, and you also mentioned that you thought you should do it before you had a full-time job and you might have to take off work for surgery and recovery and reconstruction and physical therapy and all the things that can happen as a result of a mastectomy. So at the Pink Fund, our whole purpose is to bridge a financial gap when a patient is in active treatment and unable to work. So looking back and also looking forward, knowing that you did have good insurance, knowing that your family could take care of any other ancillary costs, that you didn't have to worry about missing work or a paycheck or losing a job, what would you recommend to another who is maybe finding out she's BRCA positive, she's starting her career, or she's already employed, carries the insurance? What do you say to that woman?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend that she reach out to groups like yours. It's why the Pink Fund's mission is so critical, because there are so many women out there, as you and I have spoken, who get caught in the cycle of financial toxicity. And it is such a difficult thing to get out of once you start not being able to pay those monthly bills that come up. Insurance is one thing, but you know, if you do have health insurance, but you have had to take time off work, it's those other bills that stack up and very quickly can change your life for the worse. And so I believe that more organizations like what the Pink Fund does should exist. And I will shout it from the rooftops how essential your mission is. I was so incredibly privileged. I mean, first of all, I had this done right after the Affordable Care Act became law, meaning that the mutation was not a pre-existing condition. So I never had to deal with insurance discrimination on that front. But also, I mean, my parents paid for everything. They could afford everything. We didn't have to grapple with how to afford this, how to pay for our other cost of living. So I know that I missed out on I'm very lucky that I missed out on a completely different element of the struggle that breast cancer or any cancer frankly brings with it, because it can be just as or potentially even more excruciating to deal with the costs. There are other things that fall under a similar umbrella, but just the difficulty of, for example, getting rides to your appointments. It's possible that you may not live in an area where there are many breast specialists close by. So you need to consider, how are you going to get there? How are you going to pay for gas? What are you going to do about childcare? There are all sorts of organizations that can help with those different aspects of life. And even though it puts more burden on you to have to go out and proactively seek them, they do exist, and it's so important. And so, part of why I wrote this book and reached out to you is, if you're picking up this book because you want tips of how to get through the medical aspect, I also wanted there to be at least some resources to deal with the financial aspect. Certainly my book is just the starting point of the conversation. I've included an index in the back of the book with some additional financial resources for people. But yes, because I myself was so privileged, because the women in the book largely are financially secure, it was very important to me to also give time and energy to talking about what can be done to ease the financial pain, even though there is still so much more that should be done on a legislative level that is a different conversation.
Yeah, that would be another great conversation to have. I know that you talk about Debbie, I'm going to say Debbie, why can't I think of Wasserman Schultz, and the Early Act. That was such an important policy change for young women like yourself. Do you want to mention that?
Sure. The Early Act was very, very important. It was the first piece of legislation that directed federal funds specifically to educating medical providers on the risk of breast cancer in young women, how to talk to young women, how to apprise them of their relative risk. So it was Debbie Wasserman Schultz is also featured in the book, and she talked to me about why she wanted to passed this bill, she knew that following her experience with breast cancer and with the BRCA mutation, that she wanted to make some sort of a legislative contribution, but she didn't know at first what she wanted to do. So she talked to a lot of women dealing with this, young women like her, and she realized that this was really where the void was. It was on the gap in education that exists, not just for young women, but for the doctors that will be treating them. But of course, the first part of that, the accessing young women, making them aware, is important. And so they did a couple interesting things early on. The CDC, as a result of this Early Act funding, ended up partnering with some popular TV shows, Grey's Anatomy and The Bold Type. And so some of the episodes featured storylines talking about young women and breast cancer, and particularly young women and the BRCA gene. And so that's an incredible part of the conversation. You know, having these characters in pop culture, in media, grapple with this just brings more visibility, and it's wonderful. And it's just part of the notion of normalizing these difficult conversations. So the Early Act is a really fascinating piece of legislation, and its legacy is ingrained now that it's been around for more than 10 years.
So it's really wonderful that our entertainment industry can work in storylines that can educate, entertain, and inspire people to make changes in their lives. I want to go back for a minute to when you talked about getting ready to reduce your risk of ovarian cancer. And you don't have to answer this question, but many young women in your situation are concerned about fertility. Have you thought about that?
Yes, I have thought about that, and without, I do, at this point, I am keeping that part of my journey private for now. It won't always be the case, but it is something that I'm thinking about quite a lot. In general, the recommendation for women like me with the BRCA mutation is to remove your ovaries when you are finished childbearing or by the age of 35, whichever comes first. That has a lot to do with the fact that monitoring for ovarian cancer, prevention and early detection is not as fail-safe as are the screening methods that exist for breast cancer. So there can be better screening options. The across the board remedy basically is to remove your ovaries, to have an oophorectomy. And so I'm 33. We don't have kids yet. We want to. So you can imagine, where I am in that conversation. And it is, it's daunting. And I do think that it's part of my journey that I am going to need to reach out and I've been so focused on providing a community to talk about breast cancer, but this is the community that I myself am seeking to access now, is that community who have dealt with these issues of ovarian cancer prevention, the discussion about fertility that goes along with it, and also the discussion about menopause, early menopause, which happens when you do remove your ovaries. So all of that is something I'm actively going through, and I do want to at some point be very open about what I've gone through in the hopes that it will help others.
That will be book number 2.
Exactly.
So you profiled 30 really remarkable women who are beating breast cancer in different ways, managing it in different ways. If you had 3 top takeaways from these women, what would they be in terms of advice for somebody else, either a newly diagnosed or somebody already in treatment?
Yeah, there's a few. Number 1 is don't be afraid to be your best and most vocal advocate when you are meeting with a doctor and talking about your options. Speak up, because that's what they're there for. Doctors, sometimes, as I experienced in my own experience, and as many of the women I talked to did, sometimes doctors might leave things out that are important, but for whatever reason they don't mention it, or you might have some questions about their recommended course of action. And a lot of times we don't want to challenge our doctors. We put them on a pedestal and we want to put our full faith in them. And sometimes that comes with a bit of a reticence to challenge them. But I do think that it is critical that we all speak up for ourselves. And also, if you're not the kind of person that is used to, challenging authority like that, it can be very daunting. Bring somebody else with you, especially for those early consultations when there's a lot of information being thrown at you. It can be very helpful to bring somebody with you. I mean, as a college student, I was lucky. I was in New York. My parents are in New Jersey, so my mom came with me for most of my consultations, and we together were able to figure things out. There are a lot of accounts in the book of women who really had to speak up for themselves. For example, when one woman had to insist to her plastic surgeon doing her breast reconstruction that, no, I don't want to go any bigger. This surgeon would tell her, your husband will thank me. And I mean, that's just so gross for so many reasons, but she really had to push back and be like, listen, buddy, hands off. This is my body. I don't want this. And you need to take no for an answer. And, he was a very well-regarded surgeon, but this was not cool. And that happens to all sorts of people, regardless of their income level or the color of their skin, and all sorts of things. And that leads me to another takeaway, which I do think is important, even if it doesn't reflect all of our lived experiences, which is that currently the disparity between outcomes for Black women and white women are horrifically lopsided. Black women are 40% likelier to die of breast cancer than white women are, and that has so much to do with access to specialized care, disparities that exist in terms of clinical trials, also, just all of the institutional biases that exist that we, that I think white people are sort of gaining an increased consciousness of, but that Black and brown people have been dealing with for the entire lifespan of this nation. Those inequalities are only magnified in medical settings when you have doctors who might assume that, if you're a Black woman, you don't know as much, or you don't know as much about your own medical history. We saw that with Serena Williams. And unfortunately, there are many cases in my book of Black women who have reached, incredible heights in backgrounds, not that that should have anything to do with the quality of your care, but that have to face institutional unconscious biases on the part of their doctors. And that can be just an excruciating part of the experience that, frankly, me as a white woman have not had to deal with, but are so incredibly important to talk about. The third takeaway I would say is the importance of finding ways to give yourself a sense of control over the process. I think a lot of women, myself included, we're so used to just working harder at a problem and making it go away, but breast cancer doesn't work like that. You can't just work harder at it and have the problem get fixed. So there is a lot of giving up of control that to put trust in your doctors, to put trust in the medicine, and that can be really, really challenging. But there are ways to give yourself back some of that control. Some of it is, a bit of a mind game, but some of it is actually very real, I think. You can, a lot of the women in the book talk about, making the choice to think about their treatment in different lights. So you and I were just talking about Valerie Kondos-Field, the UCLA gymnastics coach, saying, I don't have to have chemotherapy. I get to have chemotherapy. And she really viewed it that way. And that realignment of her thinking, I think, actually helped her physically. There are other strategies. One of my favorites is Jerry Willis, who's a Fox Business News correspondent, who she would write out all of her appointments in a list and then check them off one by one, which really gave her the feeling of accomplishment and of checking off a to-do list like you would in other parts of your life. So it really just gives you that extra sense of having a stake in the process. And so there are all sorts of tricks and tips in this book for finding ways to maintain a sense of control, even when it feels like things are spiraling around you. It's not a how-to. It's not going to tell you what might work for you, but it does give some suggestions as to what worked for other people.
I want to go back a minute to the severities problem, and I experienced it with a 78-year-old African-American woman from Detroit recently. What we've learned is some of the reasons that there are higher mortality rates for women of color is that they are not given the total dose of chemotherapy that they would normally be given weight, etc. And we're done here at Wayne State University with Professor Lauren Hamill, is that when the oncologist came in to present the treatment plan, he was very concerned that the insurance coverage would cover the prescribed plan. That was number one. What he would hear from the patient, and primarily in this case it was Black African-American patients in Detroit, was that they were most concerned that the prescribed treatment plan would impede their ability to work. And if they couldn't work, they couldn't provide for their family, they couldn't make their deductibles and copays. And therefore, what was done was the chemo was given at a lower dose.
Wow.
I was completely stunned when I learned this, and it's been validated in other studies. And my new friend, 78-year-old Mildred, when she conferred with me about some of her questions. And again, Mildred also said, they're assuming I don't understand because I'm Black. And so they offered her, she had the genetic profile, didn't carry the gene, but they said, we're just going to give you a lower dose of chemotherapy. And she said, well, I don't want chemotherapy. So I helped Mildred get the Oncotype DX test, which I highly, highly recommend for anyone who's at an early stage disease. But if you can avoid chemotherapy with confidence, you should have it. Plus, it saves everybody money. But in any case, Mildred had the Oncotype DX, did not need the chemo, but her oncologist was pushing her, had administered the Mammoprint, which studies your genetic profile, but she was 78, had no familiar history of cancer that she could recount, and didn't carry any genes that would have precluded her to get this disease. So that's just an aside, but it's very interesting.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So I have one final question. And after writing this book, you heard from 30 women. We now all, through Beat Breast Cancer Like a Boss, can have our own virtual support group. What do you wish you had known as that college student, senior, now after you've learned all this?
I think I wish I would have known that this was going to end up being an incredibly positive chapter in my life. I'm very lucky for the reasons we already talked about, that I didn't have those painful decisions to make with regard to finances. But overall, this was a character shaping experience. I'm very happy with the results of my cosmetic surgeries. So I think I look great, I feel great, and I'm not going to get breast cancer. And so, I was worried when I first embarked on the journey, when I first contemplated having my healthy breasts removed. But it really ended up being something that shaped my life for the better. And of course, I've met incredible people. I'm part of this amazing community. And look, not everybody has the experience I do, but what I do know also from a lot of the women I talk to is that they also report changes in other parts of their life as a result of having gone through breast cancer. It often changes the way you look at life and the way you look at things, and it magnifies that sense of appreciation that I think we can all do more to focus on, of just being grateful for every day we have on this earth. And once you're faced in some way with your own mortality, I think when you come to the other side of that, or you come to the other side of whatever it is, whether it's your treatment or you're reckoning with your metastases or what have you, a lot of times it changes your perspective. And I've certainly struggled through my life with how I view things, keeping them in perspective, which has a lot to do with, my struggles with depression and other things. But I think that whenever we have an opportunity to readjust the way we look at the world, it is something that we can appreciate. And I think for a lot of people, that's what they end up with as a result of their cancer journey. It's not something I knew that was going to be the gift that I received as a result of it, but it would have been nice to know then, but I'm glad to know now that that's the case.
So many people don't like that word gift. So I always say that the cancer, I think it was a gift to me, but I call it the Great Awakening. Yeah. It's a sorority we don't rush to join. We're initiated immediately upon diagnosis and called a survivor. And it has given us the opportunity to meet and learn from other people whose paths we would have never crossed had it not been for that diagnosis. So Allie Rogin, awesome PBS producer. I look forward to seeing you some evening on the 6 o'clock news, which I watch religiously. Thank you so much for making time for us today. I know what you've shared is going to be so helpful to so many. Beat Breast Cancer Like a Boss can be purchased on Amazon. And finally, I want to thank Exact Sciences, the makers of the Oncotype DX test and the Cologuard test, for sponsoring this segment. And Allie, I hope we get to talk. All the best with your future decisions, and I look forward to hearing and learning what you're going to do next.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Good night.
Good night.